So let's look at a couple examples for analysis. And I strongly encourage you, if you don't already have this open, to get this file and download it, and to take a few minutes with me when I tell you to pause and try and figure these things out for yourself, because this is the best way you're going to apply this knowledge. So the first thing is, let's talk about consequences. So here I have a position on the board, and black is about to make its fifth move. White is playing something called the Calais system, which is a very common queen's pawn opening, and black is looking for a fifth move to advance their position. And I have two potential candidate moves for you. The first is knight on b8 to c6, and the second is knight on b8 to d7. And I'll go ahead and I'll show you. This is the b8 knight. So you can either go to, you can go to here to c6 or here to d7. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video, and I want you to think of both the positive and the negative consequences of each move. Start with one, completely work through it, and then either make a new page or space down a little bit, and then go with the other move and think about that and put down both the positive and the negative consequences of each move. Lastly, I want you to think and use those evaluations to figure out which of the two moves is a better move. So go ahead and pause the video now. I'll give you a couple seconds before I go forward. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you paused the video if you wanted to work on this. So let's go ahead and let's start. Our first potential move is knight to c6, which would be this knight coming out to this particular square right here. So what does that do? So a positive is that it develops the knight. That's one of our opening principles, is we want to develop all of our pieces. So that's good. That's great. Okay. Secondly, it fights for the center. This knight on c6 is going to defend both e5 and d4, two very central important squares. So the more defenders that you can place on those central squares, the more control you have over the center, which is something that we want to fight for in chess. It's very good. So those are two positive things. Another thing is something that's specific to the position. Whereas if we were to trade pawns and white were to capture back, and white would capture with the c pawn as opposed to the e pawn, because white wants to maintain their two center pawns. White wouldn't want to trade a center pawn for a side pawn. So if e captures d, if c5 captures d4 and then c3 captures d4, these two pawns will be gone, and it will potentially open up another attack. The knight can go from c6 to b4, which is threatening this particular bishop on d3. Now, specifically in the Calais system, this particular bishop, as you can see, was set up with this pawn, with these pawns protecting it, to be the key piece in this position. You can see that it's arching in towards the king side, eyeing h7, eyeing the king. So you can see that this is the extremely critical piece and probably the key piece of this entire opening system. So if we were to open up an attack and to potentially trade one of our pieces for this bishop on d3, that would be a major positional advantage for us, because we have gotten rid of white's best, most critical piece, and we have traded it for something of qualitatively less value. So those are three major pros, and we haven't really had any cons. There's not really too many cons, or really any for that matter, of moving this knight out to c6. And if there are, please comment on the video. I would certainly be open to look at it. So let's look at our second move. Knight to b7, or from knight on b to d7, which would be this knight moving to this particular square right here. So let's look at the positives. It does develop the knight. That's good. We want to develop our knight. It does protect the center. A knight on d7 will influence both e5 and c5. So that's something. That is covering one of the 4 center squares and then one of the outside ring around the 4 center squares. So that's something, right? That's okay. But let's look at the downsides. Is that if we were to have a piece right here, we would be blocking the path of the c8 bishop, that it can't move because the knight's in the way. We'd have to make at least one move before we can move the bishop, so that limits development. Also, we're limiting the scope of the queen on this particular file. So we're stopping the bishop from being able to move out. We're stopping the queen from being able to move forward. So those are 2 specific constructions that we have obstructed by placing a piece in front of another piece. So go ahead and take a couple of seconds, if you'd like to pause the video again, after my analysis, and think for a second which move you like better. Do you like knight to c6? Do you like knight to d7? Which one do you prefer? Go ahead and pause the video for a second if you need some time to think. Okay, hopefully you paused the video. So the move, at least that I recommend in this position, would be knight to c6, or our first move. So as we rationalized in our consequence list, it does develop. It goes to the most active centralized square. It covers 2 of the 4 center squares. And looking a little bit further down the line, if we're able to trade on the c file and go knight b4, we're going to unleash a very strong threat onto the white position, and that threat is we are threatening to remove that d3 bishop, which is by far white's most critical and best piece in the position. So we get rid of white's best piece. White doesn't have the same level of ammunition to launch an attack on us with. Whereas in knight d7, we're certainly controlling the middle a little bit, although we're only controlling 1 of the 4 squares as opposed to 2 of the 4 squares. We are developing a piece, but we're also hindering the development of both our queen and our bishop. So when we think about the pros and cons, there's certainly a lot more cons to knight bd7, and whereas there's really only pros to the idea of knight c6. So for those reasons, I would recommend knight c6. So let's take a look at a to-do list. So let's take a look at this example that I have on the board. So white's to move, and white needs to create a to-do list. So let's just take a quick look and evaluate the position. So if we count the pawns, looks like black's got 4 pawns and white has 5 pawns. Each player has a queen, a rook, and a bishop. So just off of material counts, quantitatively, white is ahead 1 pawn. Now, qualitatively, we can say that white is probably further ahead than a pawn, because if you look at pawn structure, right now, white has on the a5 square a passed pawn, and a passed pawn is a pawn that cannot be attacked by any other pawn ever again. Whereas black does not have a passed pawn. Any pawn that black advances eventually could be put under attack by a white pawn. White does not have that same issue, especially with the a5 pawn. So the a5 pawn is the critical imbalance in the position, whereas white has one and black doesn't have one. So since we know that's the critical imbalance, how can we turn that critical imbalance into a win? Well, as we discussed in how the pawns move, ultimately we want the pawns to get down the board all the way down to the end so that we can create a new queen and then use that queen to win the game. So the best way of going about this is to try to think how we can make that a pawn into a queen. So that's a little bit of a hint, but what I want you to do is, if you'd like, pause the video and go ahead and compile a to-do list for white. how does white win? And it doesn't have to be specific moves, but more ideas. What sort of ideas and what sort of generalities does white need to achieve in order to turn their material advantage into a win? Go ahead and pause the video. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and assume you paused the video. So let's take a look at my to-do list that I have for this example. So the first, what we're trying to do is we're trying to queen the a5 pawn, trying to get it up to a8 and win. So the first thing is that we can't, because we can't push it forward because there's pieces in the way. Well, what pieces are in the way right now? Right now the bishop's blocking it from advancing, and the queen is kind of hanging near the bishop to guard it. Now the rook's kind of in an interesting spot right now because it's on a diagonal that there's a critical construction where the queen, the rook, and the king are all in a diagonal. And technically this rook's under a pin right now, so it's not legal for this rook to move. So it's hard to say that this rook is defending or attacking rather a5, although it kind of is. We're going to need to move the king to be able to actualize that attack. So at any rate, we need to take care of the pieces that are preventing this pawn from moving forward. So we can say that this bishop and this queen are definitely preventing this piece from moving forward. Next, what we need to do is we need to put our rook behind the passed pawn, right? Rooks belong behind passed pawns to help give it more oomph for the push. Also, conversely, what that's going to do is that's going to force black into a defensive position, whereas this rook is probably going to have to retreat back to its home back rank and ultimately come in front of the passed pawn, because if we trade the bishop and the queen off, what pieces are left to get in front of the pawn to stop it from advancing? Really only the rook and the king. Well, the king's going to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves to get over to the a-file, whereas the rook can do it much, much quicker. So black's first order of business would be to get the rook. If we trade the queen and the bishop, black's first order of business would be to get the rook probably to a8 or to a7 or to a6 to prevent the movement and the progression of this a5 pawn up the board. So after we've done that, so what have we done? We've traded off the queen and the bishop. We want to trade off the queen and the bishop. We want to move the rook to a position where we have to force the other rook into defending, because that's the only piece left that's able to defend quickly. So then what pieces are left? We have our pawns on the king side and their pawns on the king side, and we have a king and they have a king. So the next thing that we need to do is get our very last piece into the game. We can bring our king, and we need to bring it up, f1, e2, d3, c4, b5, and we want to bring it up as close to our pawn as possible. And we want to do that to create local superiority of forces. If we have a rook and a king versus a rook, the rook and the king are going to win. And your opponent, if they're of any skill level, is going to realize that. So they're going to be put into a position where they're going to have to bring over their king. So you're going to get into a position where you have on the a-file, or at least close to where the white pawn is on the a-file, you're going to have the rook behind it trying to push it forward. You're going to have the king somewhere on the side of it trying to escort it, and you're going to have the black king and the rook trying to stop that particular escort. So depending on how everything works out, you may be able to advance the a-pawn just using your king and your rook. But let's say black gets the jump on us and they get their king over to defend, so it's a king and a rook defending against a king and a rook attacking, which means that that's not safe. What we can still do as our fail-safe or a safety valve is, okay, we can give up the ace, we trade off the rooks, so it's down to just kings, and ultimately the king will capture the a-pawn, but at the cost of letting black capture the a pawn, the white king could then outflank the black king, so the black king will be over here somewhere in the a file. The white king could then outflank the black king and come over and play Pac-Man and munch up this pawn, and then munch up these pawns, and then be able to move their kingside pawns up as their safety valve plan for victory. So you can see that's a relatively generic to-do plan or to-do list. I didn't say any specific moves. I didn't say that a specific piece needs to go to a specific square. We've only talked about ideas. And only talking about ideas, we've come up with not one, but two potentially winning strategies. The first of which is try and get the a5 pawn to queen down on a8, and if that doesn't work, trade down, force the black king over to the queen side, and then outflank the black king and use the white king to munch up black's kingside pawns after black takes the passed a pawn and is then out of position to defend their remaining pawns. So you can come up with a relatively elaborate and multi-step to-do plan without having to calculate any specific combinations of moves. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how. 3, 2, 1. So let's take this to-do list and see how the game played out. Remember that we have 4 objectives and potentially a 5th as a fail-safe. We're going to trade the pieces blocking the a pawn from moving. We're going to back the pawn up with the rook and threaten to continue to push it unless the other rook plays defense. We're going to bring our king up to assist the pawn and the rook to create local superiority, and then depending on what the king does, we can either advance the a pawn or we can allow the a pawn to fall and then backtrack and gobble up all of the kingside pawns. So let's see how this works. So white starts by doing the first thing in our plan, which is we need to get rid of the pieces that are blocking the way for the pawn. So queen takes b5 and rook takes b5. Now note that bishop takes b5 is not a good move because of bishop b7, which is going to allow and provide extra support for this pawn to push, and since there's no dark squared bishop, it's going to be very hard for black to stop the pawn, especially once it's reached a7. So that's not good. So we don't want that. So rook takes, and then what's the next thing? So we've gotten rid of one of the blockers of the a5 pawn. We're going to go rook a1, backing up this rook, or having the rook back up the pawn rather. Black moves to c5, rook to c5. Now remember that black didn't leave the rook here because the threat was, let's say for example, if they did some king move or something. Bishop f1 is winning because there's a skewer of this rook and the bishop cannot be defended by the rook in this position. The only way it could be defended is by going to b6. Unfortunately, that just gets taken. This is under attack. That's really bad. So black had to do something to move the rook out of the way to prevent bishop f1 coming with an extreme attack. So it goes rook c5. White continues their plan of attack. Bishop f1, trying to remove that a6 bishop that is blockading the a5 pass pawn. Black, instead of trading, which trading is not good, and if we trade here, that is, black is removing their own blockader. That's not something they want to do. And then black would basically have to, I don't know, do something like rook a7 or rook a8, because white's just going to push, do this, and then bring the king up, as it were, as you'll see in the game. So that's not going to get done for black. Black can't capture here. So instead, black has a better move, trying to play defense. White continues with their to-do plan. They remove the bishop, which was a blockader of the a5 pawn. So rook captures a5, and now we have the position that we have anticipated in our to-do list. So what have we done? We've traded the pieces that are blockading the a5 pawn, which is the bishop and the queen. So that's check. Or not check as in the game, but check as in checking off our to-do list. Second, we're threatening to promote our pawn by pushing, so we have forced the rook into a defensive passive position. Check. Taking care of that. So 2 things in the to-do list done. The third thing is approach the pawn with the king. And you'll see that play out right here. So what happens next? King f1, king e5, king e2, and now f5. So just like white has a to-do plan, black has a to-do plan, and it involves this. If black can somehow push their pawn down and somehow remove or disrupt this pawn, this pawn is the only thing right here stopping this pawn from having a free rein going down the board. So black playing f5 there is trying to break up this particular pawn, which is critical to the defense of this pawn trying to move forward. But white says, you know what, I'm not interested, and they play f4 check. Also forking the queen and the pawn, or the king and the pawn rather, forcing an exchange. Now, there's one good exchange and one bad exchange. E takes f is not good because we're removing the defender that was here of this square on d4, which we're going to need once the black king pushes the d pawn. So we don't want to do that. G takes f4. Much better. This is still protected because of this. Very good. Black moves over to try and win this pawn with the superiority of forces. White comes up to defend, or to get their king into the mix. So once again, look at our point number 3. Approach the a pawn with the king, and avoid pawn trades that would allow black's d pawn to pass. So check and check. As long as this pawn's here, that's why we traded with this pawn instead of this pawn. We avoided the pawn trade that would have made it easier for black's pawn to pass. So we checked on that, and we brought the king over from g1 now up to e3, and we'll see it continue to move. So black plays h4, trying to take away potential waiting or wasting moves from white. White plays an excellent move, rook a3, exclamation point. This may look like a innocuous move, but the rook coming to the 3rd rank plays a critical defense of this e3 pawn, so the king isn't able to come down and snatch it up. Black continues with their plan, trying to win the a5 pawn. White maintains opposition of the black king. And then black continues back to the center, realizing that if they go over here, it's going to be a relatively elementary win. Let's say if they go over here, something like king d4, and then trades, and now we look at this piece out of play. Look how out of play this king is right now. There's literally nothing stopping. King d5, capture, and then the king coming over and playing Pac-Man and munching up all of black's pawns and winning the game very easily. That's the safety net plan we had from point number 5 in our to-do list. But black knew that that was the inevitability of doing that, so they didn't do that. Black is now going to try to come over here and break up this pawn structure to try and either push this pawn or push this pawn. And we're going to see how that plays out. White's going to continue their strategy. Bring the pawn over, or bring the king over to assist this pawn going up the board, which is exactly what they do. Rook a8, backing up to play defense because king b5 is coming with a tempo on this a6 rook, so they just circumvent it by moving out of the way. White takes the opportunity to push the pawn. Black comes over here to establish this nice square for the king and to eventually provide support for this push. White moves the king up. White's going to move the king to right here, which is going to protect this square, this square, and this square. By the way, if you have a pawn that you're trying to pass, and if you can get your king to the 7th rank next to the pawn, that's basically the golden escort in, because the king, if the king's right here, it'll guard each of these 3 squares as the pawn marches up. So that's always a good thing to have. Black's trying to execute their plan, d5 threatening d4, threatening to break up these pawns. White continues their plan, having the king escort the pawn up the board. Black plays d4, trying to do their plan of breaking up these pawns. White captures. Now we have a second passed pawn right here on the d file. Black decides to take the f pawn instead of the d pawn, and then they can make their way maybe to here, maybe try to push this pawn, and then try and push this pawn. One of those 2 particular plans. White continues their plan of moving the pawn up. Black comes over to gobble up the d pawn. White gets into the golden position to escort the pawn in. Next move they're threatening takes a8. Black decides to at least get a pawn out of the exchange, so they take a7, and then f4. f4 trying to be faster than the white rook can mobilize a defense on the pushing f pawn, but white is actually in time. White goes king to c6, and actually black resigned here, but the game could continue something like king takes d4, rook h7, king e4 or king e3, rook takes h4, f3, rook h8, moving back to relocate behind the f file right here, f2, and then rook f8, and then that's pretty much going to seal the deal, because now white is absolutely willing to trade their rook for this pawn, because this pawn's going to be able to run free. And this is something that you can take away from this lesson as well, where is a pawn free and running for home? Well, if the pawn ever gets in front of the king, or ahead of the king can catch up, because the pawn can only move 1, the king can only move 1. So if this king were to move down a square, or to move off of this rank, this king would lose the defense of this pawn. So there's absolutely nothing that black can do at this point, and black can't cross the path of the rook, so black to defend this pawn would literally have to go down, and then over, something like that. And that's, to make that happen, you would have to break your own rule of don't go behind the pawn, because as soon as you go under this rank to the 1st or 2nd rank, this pawn's going to run. So we'll see what happens. King e2, escorting in the f pawn. White just goes h4, black queens. White trades it off, and then you can see very clearly that this pawn is going to win the race to the end of the board versus this king, and then mate will follow very quickly. Black can't catch up, and then white has the very elementary queen versus king endgame. which we'll talk about in a little bit. But just as a quick tip, if you get into an endgame with the queen and king versus king, you always want to be a knight's move away. You want to cut off the board. You can see that the queen is slowly constricting the king's space. The king only has these 10 squares to move. Queen does it again, cutting off more space, cutting off more space, cutting off more space, and now the king basically only has to shuffle between these two squares while the king comes up to help the queen deliver mate. So you can see that the king's going to shuffle, the king's going to move itself over. The queen has to move here because you would hate to see white play king f1 here, because that's a terrible, terrible mistake. This is a stalemate, okay, because the black king has no legal moves. Can't go here, can't go here because of the queen. The queen is covering these 4 squares, and the king is covering the last square. So the king's covering the green squares, the queen's covering the red squares. So the black king can't make a legal move. That's a draw. So white just would have wasted the game if they would have played king f1 there. So instead, white plays the good move, which is queen g4, which allows the black king, the h1 square, to be able to move back and forth h1 and h2 while the white king gets into position. So black king shuffles back and forth, white king moves into place, and then finally the white king and queen deliver mate on the black king. So let's go back and look at this position one more time. We saw that we just followed our very simple to-do list. We took away the blockaders of this pawn. We got our rook behind it. And we push as we can, and we bring our king up to help. And then we won the game in elementary fashion. So we got rid of the blockader, we got rid of a second blockader, we start to bring the king up. We don't let this pawn get traded. We trade with the other pawn. We bring our king up more. Rook a3, excellent move, guarding e3 in the 3rd rank. Black king tries to come over, realizes that it's not going to do any good, tries to take these 2 pawns instead. Black moves back. White eventually creeps up. Black tries to fracture white's pawns. White doesn't care. White's going to continue its plan. And white has enough to close out with the rook versus the pawn. And even with 1 pawn versus no pawns, white has enough speed, with this pawn already being on h4, to beat the black king down the board. So you can see a very simple to-do list, a very simple plan leads to a very clean and effective victory. So this is why the importance of not just calculation, being able to calculate 5 and 10 moves out. We didn't calculate any moves in this example. We just looked at very basic ideas, and we looked at very basic strategies, and we followed those basic strategies to a very clean win. So hopefully you got something out of this, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.